In this video, we will have an overview of the gaps model. Your organization needs to consider the 5 gaps in service delivery to ensure you can identify them and ensure to overcome them for optimal service delivery. And this includes the knowledge gap, the standards gap, the delivery gap, the communication gap, and the overall service gap. The knowledge gap is the first one you need to consider. This is the difference between what consumers expect and what management think consumers expect. If we think of a new company manufacturing or delivering coffee beans, and then they market this new bean product as affordable to consumers, affordability to consumers might mean the same price as instant coffee. But because this is roasted beans of a higher quality, then it will be a bit more expensive. So the management of this beans think to advertise it as affordable is exactly what consumers expect, and then it ends up not being affordable. Another example can be a streaming service. Let's take Netflix for an example, thinking that consumers only want or expect sci-fi or comedy, where they actually want crime documentaries and true crime stories. It can also be where Netflix management think consumers, for example, in South Africa, want 4K or 8K, where the situation in the country in terms of the cost of data doesn't necessarily allow it, and then customers expect, for example, 720p and 1080p HD, which they will be happy with in most circumstances. So this is a knowledge gap between management and what they think their consumers expect and what the consumers actually expect. How can businesses close this gap? How can you as a service organization close a specific knowledge gap? If you think of what you think your customers expect and it's something different, how do you identify this? You can use surveys, or you can read customer complaints and compliments to see what they actually expected and ensure you move on, for example, to the standards gap. This is the difference between the organization's knowledge of the consumer's perceptions and expectations and the service standards that it sets. So if you know you are manufacturing coffee beans, just rather remarket it as high quality, because some consumers might expect ethically sourced beans and high quality beans that is also tasty and easy to prepare. Then you can set your service standards to make sure it is of a high standard and you meet your customers' expectations. Another example of this is a customer dining in South Africa. We have turn and tender, or just think of your nearest, closest steakhouse. They expect food to be ready in about 30 minutes, and then it only arrives after 50 minutes. Now, for example, the steakhouse knows that the customer expects 30 minutes, so they have to set the standards to meet that, or change the communication, which we will get to later, the communication gap, so that customers know to expect that the food will only be ready in 50 minutes. Or if it's advertised as 30 minutes, also covered in the communication gap, to make sure the service standards are in place to ensure food is delivered within 30 minutes. Why does a standard gap occur? It occurs because of the insufficient standardization of tasks. For example, it can be that there aren't sufficient roles assigned in the kitchen. There's also not goal setting. So a restaurant that is busy, for example, lunchtime, breakfast time, dinner time, they need to plan according to past service. For example, they know they will serve more or less 50 plates of a specific meal and ensure that the standard of each meal is exactly the same as, for example, in an assembly line. There's also inadequate management commitment. And so we will get to realize that we are focusing on getting everything in place, bridging all of these gaps to meet customer expectations and exceed them, more importantly, because that is the reason they will return. So how do we close this gap? In essence, just focus on how it occurs in the first place. You need to make sure you standardize your tasks, set goals based on past experiences, and learn from your customers as well. And make sure the management is appropriately appointed and can manage the service being offered. If that does not occur, you will end up with a delivery gap. meaning that this is the difference between the organization's service standards. So you set all of your standards in place, but it does not deliver the service according to these service standards to your customers. This gap can occur because of the ambiguity regarding employee roles. So not everyone is sure what they are supposed to do. There's also conflicting role. One person doing someone else's job because they are not doing it, and also other forms of conflict in the roles. Poor employee job fit, so you employ someone that is not fit to perform the specific task, and lack of teamwork, inappropriate supervisory control, and so forth. If we have a look at the steakhouse example again, they might have in place that a meal will be served within 30 minutes. The assembly line is prepared. All of the meals should look the same. It should be medium rare to order, but then they deliver the medium rare to a customer asking for rare or well done, and vice versa. So these service standards are in place, but the actual execution of the service did not take place according to plan. In essence, inconsistent service standards lead to inconsistent delivery of the service. The question you have to ask yourself, because this is a very important gap to close, because everything can be in place, but the execution lacks. How do you close this? You need to provide your employees with the required knowledge and skills of how to perform your specific service. Just keep in mind the service that you offer. You also need to provide active and emotional support. Your employees might be tired, overworked, not in a good mood, and you need to provide the support as a manager. You also need to improve your internal communications. If there is a specific sequence or process for the service being delivered, you need to make sure every step happens and is executed so that the final execution can be top-notch. You also need to reduce conflict. You also need to empower your employees to act in the customer's and the organization's best interest. Now we move to the communication gap, and this happens more often than not. And this is the difference between the actual service provided and the service promised through external communication. It raises the customer's expectation and results in the customer dissatisfaction if the business does not deliver as promised publicly. If we look at Uber Eats as an example, the basis for this meal delivery system is that a customer can expect to receive their meal within 15 minutes, but a lot of the time the delivery is delayed and also the food quality is influenced as a result. Because the longer the delivery guy takes, the colder and soggier the food becomes, and this will also impact the restaurant being used because of the failure of an Uber Eats delivery person. We can also have a look at a lawyer or an attorney that will set up your last will and testament, so your will. Yes, they advertise this as being free, but they don't necessarily disclose that they will take 5% of the estate when they execute this or act as the executor on the estate. So then you think, yeah, well, it's free, but it's not. So there is a communication gap in what the service organization promises the customer and what is actually being received by the customer. How can you solve this gap? Well, don't overpromise. Don't promise something publicly without being able in the first place to deliver it. If you promise something to your consumers and they expect it, make sure you deliver on that promise. If it doesn't happen, it's always important to focus on the recovery. Address the issue. Don't hide from the issue. Because once you address the issue publicly, people become more trustworthy towards your organization, that they trust that you will deal with the situation when it goes wrong instead of ignoring it. This leads to the final service gap. And this is the difference between the customer expectations and the perceived service from the company and what ends up being delivered. So a service gap. This is basically a culmination of the 4 first gaps. If you overpromise and you have set standards but don't deliver on that, you don't know what your customers expect, or you deliver a service different to what your customers expect, you will have an overall service gap. So there will be a mismatch and you will lose customers at the end of the day. This gap can be closed by ensuring that all 4 of the other gaps are closed. So you have to start at some point, be able to identify a gap. You might not have a delivery gap, but you might have a communication gap. And this occurs within different situations. It can be a specific area of your service and not necessarily the entire service. And that's it. That's the overview of the gaps model with examples. I hope you could take something from this video. Thank you for watching.